Modern Melbourne is a series of interviews that document the extraordinary lives and careers of some of our most important architects and designers. Today, we speak with Dione McIntyre. Dione studied architecture at the University of Melbourne and was one of 8 women in her year. After graduating in 1955, Dione went on to work with Peter McIntyre in the early stages of the McIntire Practice, before becoming his partner in business and in life. Like many women in the profession during this period, Dione worked tirelessly behind the scenes in the practice whilst raising their couple's children. Dione, thanks so much for speaking with us today. I think we should start at the beginning and talk about what led you to studying architecture. Did you have a creative upbringing and creative parents, or was there another pathway that led you to architecture?
No, it was circumstantial, really. I was born during the Depression years. I was the only child our parents had. And I grew up in a situation where we lived with my grandparents for a time during those years. My mother's health wasn't good, and in those days people tended to take to their beds a bit more than they do today. So it was Grandma that sort of fed me my first real food and walked me in the street. I can remember holding her hand, and she had a long black dress on. And she was wonderful, and eventually it caught up with her because she had 5 children of her own, and I think it was just a bit much, so it was a shame. But because we were living close to Press Hill, I was taken to Press Hill as a very small child, and I just loved it. There was a whole atmosphere about the school that sort of fascinated me. And of course, being an only child, I couldn't get there quick enough. So I was enrolled, and we moved into another house then.
And Press Hill is a very creative and almost experimental school, especially during that time. So that must have had some impact on the way that...
Well, Miss Little Senior was the leading light. You know, she would call us all out into the rear area every morning, and she'd tell us tales from Pilgrim's Progress, and there was a certain element of teaching, not really in a religious way, but just factual. That's a fact of life, and we wrote our own plays, and everything was fun. It really was, and I still remember all the children that I grew up with there. Well, I suppose that I appreciated being with young people instead of older aunts and so forth.
So from Press Hill, was there a natural path to studying architecture?
Well, I left Press Hill in 1938, and by that time my parents were living in Melinda, which was a guest house in Cotham Road. It was one of the old homes. In fact, it was the old home of Abel Hoadley, better known as the Violet Crumble man. And he had 12 children in this big house, and it was a famous house at the time, famous for its special roof and a dragon on the roof, which everyone used to comment upon. But I could see in that house that it caught my imagination. Maybe that was the first germ of my architectural appreciation. I didn't know who Robert Haddon was, but the house was great, and we had the ballroom. And all our furniture was within this room, divided by the Japanese screens which my mother had collected over the years. And what we did was we would go for all our meals in the communal dining room, and they had individual tables for all the guests, and menus and things. It was all rather posh. And then, of course, war broke out. And immediately the place was closed down because the proprietors were German and they were interned right on the spot. So we were virtually told to leave. Anyway, a little bit later, my mother found a house in John Street, and by that time my father was away training in the Air Force as a ground staff member. He was too old for flying, you see. And one thing led to another. The bombs landed in Darwin and Broome, and war broke out, and everyone reacted differently, but the whole thing disbanded very quickly. Mm-hmm. It was a whole change of life, really. At that point, I felt that was a momentous part of my life when we all made that move. And I was then enrolled at school at MLC during the war years, and it was a pretty dreary sort of time. We were there with our grey uniforms and lisle stockings and everything. We had blackouts by that time, and we were all packed to be able to be sent off to the country if need be.
At any moment.
Or the young children, yes. Or young people. And, the threat of war was really real. I mean, you couldn't imagine it having grown up today, I guess, what it was like. The fact that people, air raid wardens would come and say there's a chink of light coming out of that window, madam, you must do something about that. You've seen it all in overseas films and so forth, but we were living that. Mm. But when Father went away, with just the two of us living there, Mother took over his business, which was pretty dramatic since she wasn't a very healthy woman at that stage. And she ran that all through the war years.
What was his business?
It was the clothing manufacturing. They had an office in Majorca House, which is another architectural landmark, which I sort of appreciated in a way. Never anticipating I had anything to do with architecture, but
now when you think back through,
yes, there are associations which I recall.
And
anyway, in the very last stages of the war, when the Americans had come into the war, and Australia had joined in to finish it off, we hoped. And my father, they were building an airfield to land troops, and he was killed by a landmine. Anyway, that changed our lives yet again, because we'd always imagined that our little house in John Street would be our home after the war, and it was so close to the end of it.
And so because your father was killed in the war, that gave you an opportunity to go to university on a scholarship, I believe?
That's true.
And
yes.
Then you had a meeting with the guidance counsellor or career counsellor, and they sort of took you through all the different professions that you could study for.
Yes, I was called in one day after matriculating to be interviewed by a member of Legacy with a view to sending me to university. Now, I had any idea of a university life at all. So I went in there to an office in St Kilda Road overlooking the shrine. I was looking at the shrine. That's an interesting building.
Another architectural point.
Architectural feature, yeah. Yes. And so he said, "What would you like to study?" And I said, "I have no idea." So we took out the university handbook and started off. I can't think what the first ones now was, animal husbandry or something. And we got as far as architecture. And then someone walked into the room and talked to the gentleman, and I looked at the shrine and thought, oh, that wouldn't be bad. And so when he came back, I said, I think I'd like to do architecture, which saved a lot of time. Anyway, that's the way it was, and I was enrolled at the university to start in I think it was March 1950.
And what was university life like at that time? So the city's coming out of war.
That's right.
Was it quite an optimistic
things
period?
Were just nicely, developing from austerity, which we had, where everything was rationed. You couldn't do anything much without something being affected by war or scarcities and so forth. So I went to the very first day and caught the bus and the tram and walked along Grattan Street to the main entrance, and there was the architecture school.
And this is the university?
Yes.
University of Melbourne.
University of Melbourne. And instead of one of the cloisters, there we were being ushered into a collection of army huts. That was a surprise. That wasn't my idea of what the university would be like.
No, and especially architecture, the architecture school, or faculty.
But these people all came from everywhere. All the whole of the faculty, the Italia people and everything, and they all came into the central lobby, which was one of the huts, and it was the space where all the drawings were assessed, and any gatherings of the school were held. And I could sense there was a great excitement there, and they all told me that Robin Boyd and Roy Grounds would be teaching, but that didn't mean very much to me, I must say, at the time. Professor Brian Lewis was there with his little thing of snuff, and away he went and introduced and welcomed everybody, and there was a fantastic atmosphere. Now, Brian Lewis had been there for 3 years by that time, so he had established a staff. He'd chosen people that he felt were right, and I realised that it was going to be fantastic.
And you were one of 8 female students at the time, out of, say, a group of 80 architecture students, would that be right? I
don't know about the group of 80, that would be the whole school, I would think. But yes, there were 8 of us, and that was the largest number they'd ever had. There was always 1 or 2, perhaps, started and didn't always complete the course. But when I was there was a lady called Emma Good, and she was the very first woman that had taken the course. And she was allocated to us to teach us architectural history. And she had all the details of the columns and everything all graphically portrayed, and we had to learn that. But the course was very varied. We did fine arts with another department. We did design with Robin Boyd in the very first year. I can remember the subjects that he set for us still. There were some Chinese people who were there under the Colombo plan, and I think 2 of the girls were from Singapore or somewhere. And Marjorie Ho was she was not one of the ones I was thinking of, but she came from Singapore, and she was a really leading light in the year, because she had done ballet, and she could cook, and she could teach us to speak in a Chinese restaurant. We'd go off and use chopsticks and think we were pretty clever by then. And anyway, it was a mixed bag of people. Not all of them were able to continue. Some dropped out after first term, or certainly first year.
And is this where Peter enters your life? Because he would have been teaching perhaps at the university around that time.
He just graduated 2 years before me. I think he finished in 1947. I don't know the dates quite, but I think he finished in 47. And so I didn't meet him for a couple of years, when he was introduced as the person that was going to run this architects' review, and we all had to take part. And I happened to have been in a little ballet number which was being reviewed by Peter, and it involved Eskimos. And I sort of came out of an igloo wiggling my bottom, and he said, "Everyone stop. I want to make this a solo dance." He said, "I want you girls to step aside, and I just want that one to do the dance." That was me. That was funny.
Well, the university has a long history of these kind of more comic reviews within the faculty.
That's right. Yeah. Well, that was the most creative thing we had, really. People like Colin Munro and Philip Sargent made wonderful stage sets, things that wiggled, and machinery that went off and it gave steam and all this sort of thing. Apart from that, there was all the review numbers that Robin Boyd was very instrumental in writing words for, which still come into our minds.
Yes. So with your university course, you had to do a holiday placement, I believe, and that was at Bates Smart to start with. Can you tell me about that time?
Well, yes, amongst our year we had at least 2, maybe 3 sons of architects in the course, and one of them was Andrew McCutcheon, and Andrew chose to nominate to his father the people in the year that he thought might be employable. So I was invited to take part in the work of Bates Smart and McCutcheon during the holidays, and that was work experience, I guess you would be categorised as. Well, I found that was not the sort of environment that I would wish to work in, and I was a bit concerned that here we are, I was sitting in the back row of a large office, and every time the staff went out of the room, the fun and games would start, and I thought, I don't like this. I shouldn't be telling tales out of school, but I won't mention any names. But I decided that it was not for me. So I thought, at that time, in the Small Home Service article in The Age, there was an article about competition for small homes. And here was this one drawing which stood out to me, and it was Peter's interpretation of the Beulah Hospital, and he'd reduced it down to the more domestic scale, so that it worked beautifully as a little house with a central tank of water, which was derived from the Beulah Hospital design. And I looked at this and I thought, wow. So I pinned it up next to my bedroom, in my bedroom next to the bed, and I thought, I'm going to go and ask for a job with him. This is coincidental. I didn't have any contact with him before that, since the review years.
And did you put those two together? Did you realise that it was the Peter McIntyre that had...
Oh, I did.
You did?
I did, so I rang up to make an appointment. He wasn't even there. Kevin Borland interviewed me, and he told Peter that he'd employed me on his behalf.
Smart man.
It was all very casual. Now, the office was down in St Kilda Road, 441 St Kilda Road. It was an old white house run by a fellow they called Papa Horn. He was a sort of theatrical man who used to dress up all the time and decorate the fountain in the front of the building and have fun. I think he rented rooms throughout. And the boys had hired the ground floor. There was a ballroom. There's a ballroom in all these old houses, and some adjoining rooms, and they'd taken it over. And it was at the time of the Olympic pool design. Peter wanted someone to look after his new practice while he was working with the consortium of architects doing the Olympic pool.
And so that's John and Phyllis Murphy.
John and Phyllis Murphy.
And Kevin Borland, obviously, was very instrumental.
Yes, and Bill Irwin was also involved. So they had the ballroom to themselves, and I was in the outer office. I'd go through the day's work with Peter and then look after everything. He was next able to come out and talk to me. But they were interesting times.
So one of the first projects that you worked on with Peter, I believe, was the River House. Is that right?
That's correct. Its origin went back to the time he bought the property in 1947, and he had it for a couple of years and to pay for the land, and then it got to the stage where he was going to build something, and he had the site all worked out, and I happened to be in the drawing office at the time that he was doing his initial sketches. So that was actually my first job there. And after a while I said to myself, this is ridiculous, you know, what is he going to do in this house? It's not, he hasn't given me a brief of any sort. Don't know how many rooms he expects to divide the structure up into. So I said to him, would you mind being a bit more explicit about this and tell me what it is you're going to provide? And he said, well, I'd like you to come out into the Faulkner Park with me. I'd like to talk to you. And I said, oh. Anyway, he led me out there into Faulkner Park and we sat down on the bench and he proposed marriage. And he said, the house is for you and me. And I said, oh. So we went back into the building and announced our engagement, and everyone was surprised, but not displeased, I suppose.
Delighted, I'm sure.
And so we immediately worked out that there was a room. Only problem was, of course, that there was no room for additional bedrooms for the children. So as the children arrived, we were going going into the adding on bit. And the 2 decks on either end eventually became bedrooms, which have since been demolished, so it's gone back to square one. People can't quite work out, how has it got rooms on the end of it? They're not there now, But that was another story.
And it's a house that you lived in for 20 years with your growing family?
We lived in each house for about 20 years. We lived in there for 20 years. We lived in Swinton. We were always very, very fond of Swinton, the old house that on the corner of Swinton Avenue, where Archie Cahoon, the artist, had lived with his wife when we first arrived here. And we had offered to purchase it because it was coming into the time when we were doing the strategy plan, and we were looking for accommodation for people to stay. And anyway, he eventually rang and asked us if we would like to buy it, and we did. So we renovated it. It was very derelict, and we took pleasure in restoring it. And then Peter became the professor of architecture, and his life changed a little bit around that time because he had to make allowance for the fact that he was determined to keep running the practice at the same time as being the professor. Now, that meant that he was leading long hours of work, and he decided that it was not for him to live in the old house the way it was. So we decided to build this one. From my point of view, the summer house was going to be something that we did leased for income as we got older. And but we realised that it was perhaps the next step in our lives to go into something more up to date.
And you've had 20 lovely years in this house, haven't you?
Yes, we have, and turn of the century we came, and no, it's been very good. Now, Swinton, of course, has been restored by others, and it's almost unrecognisable now. But
And you worked on Summer House and on these other projects. You and Peter really worked very closely together, didn't you? And you've done that over many decades.
By the time we got to this part of our lives, I was taking less of a role in the office. We'd gone through the stage of being at Marland House when the strategy plan was on, and that was so that we could view the whole of Melbourne. And the office at that stage had become quite large. There were somewhere between 70 and 100 people working there.
It's a large practice.
Yes. And so that obviously that once that phase was over, we had no further use of that space, and we left Marland House, and we came out to the River House. Oh, sorry, no, I beg your pardon. We came to Church Street in Hawthorn before that. Now, Church Street was a building which Robin happened to have altered. It was something in the line of manufacturing of clothing. And we were there for a short time. And then we reduced the size of the office and came and modified the River House, which was not being used, and that became the office. And then eventually that became a bit small, so we extended another building that was here to take the overflow.
It's incredible how River House has
It's
supported your life.
It's always been there, yes.
In so many different ways.
Yeah, that's right. And now everyone is most interested in it. When it was first built, when the River House was first built, we'd go out for dinner or somewhere, and people would say, "Do you still live in that house?" And I remember initially when we first moved in, I was in a tram. I have to walk to the tram, catch the tram to the city, and someone said, "Oh goodness, what is it?" And by that time, the leaves had all fallen off the trees, and for the first time we realised that you could see this yellow and red concoction from the tram and everyone who passed by. And the whole tram moved to one side. "I know on authority what it is," said someone. "It is a boat shed." "Oh." And so I just sit there and pretend.
Did you sit there quietly? You just pretended that you had no idea or no connection?
Anyway, it went through various stages and it had to be sheeted in timber to protect the thin walls that we could afford at the time when we first married.
It would be great to talk about that time where, you mentioned it before, that there was a time where the practice really changed tact and went from small residential to commercial.
Yes.
But
that goes back to the 60s actually, when Peter was, he was struggling with a small practice and realised he was never going to get very far with just the number of small buildings and houses and things he was doing, and that he had to do something about it if he was going to have a chance to be creative in this world. So we sold the car and he bought an airline ticket and went overseas. And when he came back, I waited to hear what was going to be said, and when I drove out to the airport and came back, and he said, "Right, things are never going to be the same again." And I thought, "Oh." He said, "No," he said, "we're going to have a commercial practice. I'm going to do this." And then came back, and that's what he did. If Peter decides to do something, that's what happens usually.
But when he went away travelling and made that decision, you were running the practice.
I did
during that time.
I did. I was determined, because things were tough financially, that I was going to make a success of it. It was only a matter of weeks, but I did manage to find a client and design a lodge at Falls Creek and get paid for it, and there was money in the bank. So that was good.
All during that relatively short period.
Sure.
Yeah. It would be wonderful to talk about some of the earlier projects that you worked on with Peter in the practice together.
Yes, well, we were still down at St Kilda Road, of course. There was the Brunt House, which overlooks the boulevard, and the Snellman House at East Ivanhoe. The Snellman House is still occupied. It's lost its two big river red gums about which it coiled originally. The Brunt House has been altered extensively, so it's almost unrecognisable. They were two of the main ones, and the McCarthy House was one of a series of steel-framed houses we built. And we built the Arch House series, which is, they were successful. There was one at Bensdale which was abandoned during construction and not so long ago restored by a new owner, and it's been acclaimed and appreciated by a lot of people. There were other things too. There was a farm. No one ever heard about this one probably, but there was a pharmacy down called the Brocci Pharmacy, which I remember doing the interior of, and and decorated it with tiles and old-fashioned containers representing the chemical part of things.
And is that still standing?
I believe so. But there's so many of them sort of scattered around that you wouldn't know whether they're there or not. And then you discover it, like the Brunt one recently, which someone reminded us of.
So it sounds like you both had a very busy life and career running the practice together. I'm interested in the time when you started to have children and raise a family and how you handled that. Did you step back from the practice, or did you just sort of start to take that in your stride?
Well, we started having children very soon after we were married, and we not only had one, 30 months later we had two, and a third one, and then it was a little while before the last one, Annie, arrived. At no stage was I able to do everything at once. I did employ help with raising the children, and there were times when I regretted leaving it to other people. I must admit that. But we battled on, and having the children it changed our lives quite a lot. It involved alterations to where we lived and so forth. And I don't know whether the children regretted the way they grew up, but they did have a pretty varied life with trips to the snow, and we spent time at the beach.
And living on a very beautiful property in Melbourne.
And I feel that having the property was very remedial in a lot of ways for all of us, really.
And the children have gone on, nearly all of them, to work as architects or work in architecture or study design or architecture. So you could assume that perhaps they were quite inspired by the life that was presented to them.
I'm sure they were affected by the whole scene of our lives, really, yes.
Dione, it's been absolutely delightful speaking with you today. Thank you.
Thank you.